What happens when a promise of safety turns into years of sorrow? When a mission to free a nation leaves it more divided than before? This is not just the story of a war. It's the story of choices, of consequences, and of countless lives caught in between. Let's take a gentle walk through the journey of America and Iraq, and listen closely to what history still wants us to hear. In the early 2000s, the United States government, led by President George W. Bush, became increasingly concerned about the actions of Iraqi President Saddam Hussein. After the tragic attacks on September 11, 2001, the U.S. shifted its foreign policy toward eliminating threats before they could harm American citizens. Iraq was soon identified as a possible danger. American leaders believed that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, or possibly nuclear weapons, that could be used against the United States or its allies. These claims were based on intelligence reports and Hussein's past actions, including his use of chemical weapons in the 1980s. There was also growing concern about Iraq's possible ties to terrorist organizations, particularly Al-Qaeda. Although the connection between Saddam and Al-Qaeda was debated and never clearly proven, the Bush administration argued that removing Saddam was necessary to prevent future attacks. At the same time, some leaders believed Iraq's people deserved freedom from a brutal dictatorship. Saddam Hussein's government was known for suppressing dissent, torturing opponents, and committing serious human rights abuses. To many in the U.S. administration, the war was both a matter of national security and a moral mission. Despite objections from some allies and members of the international community, the U.S. built a coalition of nations to support military action. On March 20, 2003, the invasion of Iraq began. This event was called Operation Iraqi Freedom. The U.S. military, along with British and other coalition forces, launched a swift and powerful attack to remove Saddam Hussein from power. The plan was to eliminate the supposed weapons of mass destruction, end support for terrorism, and create a democratic government in Iraq. While the military operation began quickly and successfully toppled the regime, the reasons behind the war would later become a subject of deep controversy. As the invasion of Iraq began in March 2003, American and coalition forces moved rapidly through the country. Within weeks, they reached Baghdad, Iraq's capital, and launched a powerful assault. The Iraqi military, weakened by years of sanctions and previous conflicts, offered limited resistance. On April 9, 2003, Baghdad fell. One of the most symbolic moments was the toppling of Saddam Hussein's statue in Firdos Square, broadcast across the world. It marked the collapse of the regime that had ruled Iraq for decades and signaled a moment of victory for the invading forces. Saddam Hussein himself went into hiding, and the government structure disintegrated almost overnight. The U.S. administration expected that the fall of Baghdad would be followed by a transition towards stability and democracy. However, after the capital was captured, the reality on the ground grew more complex. Looting spread across Baghdad and other major cities as law and order broke down. Government buildings, museums, and even hospitals were stripped bare. The Iraqi police and military had collapsed, leaving no reliable institutions to manage the streets or protect civilians. The sudden power vacuum created uncertainty and fear among the population. In an effort to rebuild the country, the U.S.-led Coalition Provisional Authority made a controversial decision to disband the Iraqi army and remove members of Saddam's Ba'ath Party from positions of power. This move left thousands of trained soldiers and government officials without jobs, pushing many toward resentment and rebellion. Although the initial phase of the war was a military success, the aftermath of Baghdad's fall revealed that winning the war was very different from securing the peace. The early days of liberation quickly turned into confusion, frustration, and the beginning of a long and unstable occupation that would challenge both Iraqis and Americans in the years to come. After the fall of Saddam Hussein's government, Iraq entered a period of deep and dangerous uncertainty. While the dictatorship was gone, there was no clear plan in place to rebuild the country or provide security. The disbanding of the Iraqi army and the removal of Ba'ath Party officials left a massive gap in leadership, governance, and law enforcement. Into this vacuum stepped a mix of local militias, former regime loyalists, criminal gangs, and foreign fighters. The result was the rapid emergence of an armed insurgency aimed at resisting the American presence and the new Iraqi authorities. Bombings, ambushes, and kidnappings became part of daily life. One of the most dangerous groups to emerge was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. This group carried out brutal attacks not only against coalition forces, but also against civilians, especially targeting the Shia population in an attempt to ignite a civil war. Sectarian tensions between Iraq's Sunni and Shia communities, which had long existed under the surface, began to boil over. Militias formed on both sides, Sunni, insurgents and Shia militias like the Mahdi army, leading to cycles of revenge killings, car bombings, and mass displacement. Baghdad and other cities became divided by neighborhoods, with walls separating Sunni and Shia communities for protection. The violence spiraled out of control, and by 2006, Iraq was caught in what many observers described as a full-blown civil war. Daily life for ordinary Iraqis became a constant struggle for survival. Trust between communities shattered, many families fled their homes, and entire cities became battlegrounds. The American forces, initially seen by some as liberators, were now often viewed with anger or suspicion. As the insurgency grew more complex, the U.S. military faced a war without a clear front line or enemy uniform, and the dream of quick peace faded rapidly into chaos. By 2006, the violence in Iraq had reached a critical level, with hundreds of civilians being killed each month in bombings, shootings, and sectarian attacks. The U.S. government recognized that its existing strategy was failing to bring stability. In response, a new plan was introduced in early 2007, known as the Surge. This involved sending over 20,000 additional American troops into Iraq, with the goal of improving security, especially in Baghdad and the Anbar province, where violence was most severe. General David Petraeus was placed in command, bringing a new approach focused not only on military force but also on protecting the civilian population and building trust with local communities. One of the central ideas of the Surge was counterinsurgency. Instead of simply hunting down enemies, troops were encouraged to live among the people, establish local security, and create conditions where Iraqis could begin to rebuild their neighborhoods. Alongside the military strategy, the U.S. worked to train and equip Iraqi security forces so they could eventually take over responsibility for their own country's defense. Another key factor during this period was the Sunni awakening, where Sunni tribal leaders in western Iraq turned against al-Qaeda and began cooperating with U.S. forces, providing valuable intelligence and local support. As a result of these combined efforts, levels of violence in Iraq dropped significantly in 2007 and 2008. Markets reopened, children returned to school, and in some areas, life began to feel somewhat normal again. However, while the surge provided a temporary improvement in security, it did not fully resolve the deeper political and sectarian problems that had torn the country apart. Many of the underlying grievances remained unaddressed, and the question of long-term stability in Iraq still lingered, even as the situation on the ground appeared to improve for a time. The Iraq War left a heavy toll on both civilians and soldiers, shaping countless lives with pain, sacrifice, and loss. For Iraqi civilians, everyday life became a struggle for survival. Bombings in markets, shootings at checkpoints, and night raids shattered any sense of normalcy. Families were often caught in the crossfire between insurgents, militias, and foreign troops. Schools were closed, hospitals were overwhelmed, and basic services like electricity and clean water became unreliable. Over 4 million Iraqis were either displaced within the country or forced to flee abroad, seeking refuge from the chaos. Many lost loved ones, homes, and livelihoods, and the psychological scars of fear and trauma became deeply embedded in the population. For American soldiers and their allies, the war was equally devastating. Over 4,000 U.S. service members lost their lives during the conflict, with many more wounded, some physically, others mentally. Young men and women deployed to Iraq often faced unpredictable dangers, from roadside bombs to sniper attacks. The stress of multiple deployments, the moral ambiguity of urban warfare, and the constant pressure of distinguishing enemies from civilians left many veterans struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, depression, and anxiety after returning home. Some came back to find their families had changed, their communities unfamiliar, and their own identities shaken. The war also deeply affected military families who waited anxiously at home. They lived with constant fear and the emotional strain of watching the news, hoping not to see familiar faces in grim reports. Memorials, folded flags, and letters delivered by officers in uniform became tragic symbols of sacrifice. Across both Iraq and the United States, the war created a generation marked by loss and resilience. It reminded the world that the costs of war extend far beyond the battlefield and linger long after the fighting ends. In 2009, the United States began a gradual withdrawal of its combat forces from Iraq under the leadership of President Barack Obama. By the end of 2011, the last U.S. troops left the country, officially ending America's military mission there. While the departure marked the conclusion of a long and costly war for the United States, Iraq remained fragile and deeply divided. The government, though democratically elected, was plagued by corruption, weak institutions, and growing authoritarianism. Many Iraqis felt excluded from power, especially within the Sunni community, which had once dominated under Saddam Hussein, but now felt marginalized by the Shia-led government. The absence of U.S. forces left a security vacuum in several areas, especially in northern and western Iraq. The Iraqi army, though trained by American forces, often struggled with leadership, loyalty, and readiness. Into this fragile environment stepped a new threat, a brutal extremist group that would later call itself ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq, and Syria. Formed from the remnants of al-Qaeda in Iraq and fueled by regional instability, particularly the war in neighboring Syria, ISIS began to gain ground rapidly. In 2014, they captured Mosul, Iraq's second-largest city, and declared a so-called caliphate. The legacy of the war became even more complicated as the United States found itself drawn back into Iraq, this time to fight ISIS alongside Iraqi and Kurdish forces. For many observers, this resurgence of violence highlighted the unfinished nature of the conflict and raised questions about whether the original goals of the war had truly been achieved. Although Saddam Hussein had been removed and a new government installed, Iraq remained unstable, divided, and vulnerable to extremism. The end of formal U.S. occupation did not mean the end of the war's consequences, which continued to shape the region and American foreign policy for years to come. The story of the America and Iraq War is not just a tale of politics and battles. It is a story of people. People who hoped, people who feared, people who lost, and people who tried to rebuild. From the dusty streets of Baghdad to the quiet homes of soldiers' families far away, the war left behind memories that still echo today. It began with promises of safety and freedom, but unfolded into years of struggle, confusion, and pain for both nations. Though the war officially ended, its impact remains alive, in the hearts of those who lived through it, and in the lessons the world continues to learn. It reminds us that behind every decision made in distant halls of power, there are lives, dreams, and futures that matter deeply. And perhaps with listening, care, and courage, we can write better stories for tomorrow.